Welcome, everybody, to conversation number 2 with Dr. Val Brown, the co-creator of the NeurOptimal Neurofeedback system. Very excited we get to have another conversation and explore in more depth, specifically your adventures into the world of neurofeedback in the 90s, and then how you created the NeurOptimal system out of your experiences there and changes in technology. Maybe we could just start with just giving us a sense of, like, in the early years of neurofeedback exploration and the beginning of the development of systems, kind of what was going on, what was your involvement? Just to kind of give us a sense of the early years.
Well, the earliest years actually were the 60s and 70s, sort of in parallel with, Timothy Leary and psychedelics and humanist psychology and exploring consciousness and this sort of thing. Early devices basically focused on what was colloquially referred to as the alpha band. One of the reasons was because it was the easiest one to detect. Close your eyes, and for most people, alpha amplitude, depending on the system and a variety of things, increases. And that's that sort of pleasant relaxation that you feel when you close your eyes. And it's a precursor to sleep. So it's a very important transitioning that we must do, once a day anyways. And so it was easy to get a hold of that, if you will, in terms of the very rudimentary systems. But the problem was everybody had in their mind that, more was better, that kind of a thing. So bigger amplitudes, longer wave trains, sustain the quote state as long as you could, because that was very cool. Very rudimentary equipment. And I was undergrad at Georgetown in the 70s and was part of that, and just realized, this is the Wright brothers flyer and we're trying to go to the moon. It's the wrong technology. We have to wait for it to improve. So I put all of my ideas kind of on the shelf because I knew that it was going to be probably around the year 2000 that we'd get enough computing capability widely available for consumers. That's just sort of the way it was. So in the 90s, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, so just to kind of get a sense, so there was some sort of EEG sensors that were being used to detect the voltage that we then call alpha waves, which is that state of sort of calm. And the idea was, let's try to create that state of calm, increase it.
Yes, because it was seen to be sort of similar to meditative awareness. That kind of idea was what was going on. And most of the systems back then were single channel. So a single active sensor, a single reference, and then a ground. And frequently the active was actually put back somewhere in the occipital region, because when the eyes close, of course, that area sort of shuts down more than it does during the eyes open. And that's where you could really pick up this shift, this very clear shift. That was kind of interesting. And the Menninger group really kind of ran with that. Gene Peniston, his early work evolved out of that. That became sort of the meditative consciousness oriented group. The other group was kind of constellating around Barry Sturman and his work with cats and understanding sleep architecture and the recognition of sensory motor rhythm, or as it's colloquially referred to, SMR, which is also colloquially referred to as the cat frequency. Those of you who are owned by cats, you'll know what I mean. It's when the cat is just sitting there motorically quiescent, just stationary. But as soon as the mouse moves, the cat's right on it. So sensorially engaged, motorically quiescent. And he found, interestingly enough, that he could teach cats to increase the amount of time and the intensity level, the amplitude of the SMR that they produce. Now, to my mind, that should have received the Nobel Prize because it developed in the work of mitigating the effects of tetramethylhydrazine, which was an additive NASA used in rocket fuels, which is toxic. It's a neurotoxin. And people were getting increased seizure activity from it and that sort of thing. So they were trying to figure out, how do we deal with this? He realized that he could train the cats to diminish the response curve so that they could take more doses of this neurotoxin, showing no effect until finally they were overdosed and they just died at that point. So it was a very clear demonstration that a simple learning task could directly change psychophysiology, neurophysiology, et cetera. And basically the world kind of yawned,
Uh-huh.
which was
And
unfortunate.
And I think an important thing to note about that is that we would definitely call that, from a human brain point of view, the unconscious brain, right? Because it's a cat
Yes,
brain.
yes.
So it's not that conscious learning process,
Right.
right?
Well, yeah, and you may want to pretend that what some people achieve in, neurofeedback or hypnosis or whatever is placebo, but you got a long way to go to get me to accept the idea that cats go along with placebo. If you're, like I say, if you're
Mhm.
owned by cats, you know what I mean. It was an interesting tension that was set up between these early poles in the field, if you will, the sort of meditative, contemplative, let's explore and expand consciousness versus no, let's control symptoms, especially seizing activity. And let's find out the nuts and bolts. How do we make use of this medically, if I can say it that
So
way?
to prevent seizures
To diminish
in that
seizures. Yeah, and that became Joel Lubar's original work, was seizure control, which was fascinating. Um, he was one of the other early people, he and his wife, Judith, were students of Barry Sturman and colleagues. Um, but I put all that on the shelf because I knew the technology was way behind what I wanted to do. First off, it was very low order digital signal processing, which is how the voltage readings then become separated out into things that people believe are separate bandwidths. They really aren't. They're just ways of accounting the flow of that energy. So we don't really have alpha waves or beta waves or gamma waves. It's a way that people have been talking about it that is very similar to phrenology, which over 100 years ago was this pseudoscientific approach to saying, oh, they have a big forehead, so they must be very intelligent because that's where intelligence is. It was bumps on the head that were telling you, what the person's capabilities were. And of course, that got turned into all sorts of sociologic things that had unfortunate consequences. It's just not true. None of that's true, really. And that got populated now more recently in this idea that the brain is composed of these discrete regions, and each
right,
region
because
does one thing or something else. How I got back into neurofeedback, I actually started working as chief psychologist for a countywide hospital system. And when I showed up there, they said, "Oh, we have some biofeedback equipment." I went, "Oh, okay, let me look at it." And I looked at it, and it was a little out of date kind of stuff. And so I said, "Well, send me to a conference. Let me kind of see, what's out there, what's the state of the art these days." So I went to a conference and I ran into this guy in a booth. And he said, "Oh, we have a 4-channel rig here, and it can measure brainwave synchrony." And I said, "Great, hook me up. I know how to do the state. Let me see. Let me see if it really can." And yeah, it actually could. And I went, "Oh." Well, that's really interesting. How do you program this and how are you capturing the signal? And what do you, and I started to get into this very technical decision with the programmer who was there. And that system, the CapScan Prism 5 was what it was. And the precursor to it, which was the CapScan, became the basis systems for me to use to develop the 5-phase model. Because one was a one-channel system, that was the CapScan, and the Prism 5 was actually a 4-channel system, which could, and both of them could be fairly modified given some limitations, which was different from the way most of the systems were at the time. I could go in and choose how I wanted to filter the activity, which meant I could highlight or diminish apparent activity from what other people were referring to as frequency bands. If I wanted to emphasize alpha, I could do that. I could make modifications. Instead of emphasizing alpha, I could emphasize beta, or varieties of things. I could go and explore different ways of looking at the data that no one had looked at yet. Basically, no one had seen fit to look at the crossover between those various bands. And in doing that, some really interesting experiences emerged that really redefined for the field, in my opinion, what was really going on in neurofeedback. Because most of the people at the time were very good-hearted, well-intentioned, professionals committed to their task, but they didn't understand the basic tools very well. So they just accepted what was given to them by the designers, if you will, of
And
the
so
equipment.
what were they doing? So just to kind of just a simple broad view of what were these early neurofeedback trainers trying to accomplish and kind of how?
Well, Barry Sturman started this idea that it was basically operant conditioning, which was fascinating because his original experimental setup was actually a clever integration of operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Now, we don't need to get into the specifics of that, but part of what was intriguing when Sue and I got together, her PhD studies were done at SUNY in Stony Brook, so State University of New York, Stony Brook. And at the time, it was arguably one of the last bastions of applied behavioral analysis. So, hardcore operant conditioning. I mean, she understands operant conditioning, and her background was in psychophysiology as a totality, cardiovascular reactivity. She's 30 papers published and all of that. And so the idea that neurofeedback was operant conditioning was kind of laughable to her because it's so clearly not. That's a whole other topic.
So if
But
it
this
was,
idea that you're trying to increase consciously by
mhm.
deliberate practice and skill repetition to have a target state, let's say beta increase with theta suppress, which became a big thing at the time for some forms of ADD in order to focus. So you would, try to get Superman to fly above the clouds or, whatever the game was, or Pac-Man, and try to collect all the Pac-Mans that you could, kind of thing. And it was very conscious, yeah, way to go kind of thing from the trainer, and very active role. The problem with that is that yes, you may build a habit, you may build a skill, but if you're doing it in terms of operant conditioning, you're using the paradigm that acquires the skill the most quickly possible, but then also extinguishes it most quickly when you no longer provide that reinforcement. So you remove that electronic M&M, and the sort of hook, the, the the reinforcement, the reason for wanting to do it diminishes and falls right off. So it becomes a skill that you have to consciously choose to practice, and you have to choose to practice this skill if it's ADD in the classical approach when you're in the classroom that you experience as boring because you're a very distractible kid who is, quite likely ahead of the class in a lot of ways. and is getting bored because of how things are being presented, and he's being told to sit in the chair the whole day, and like, yeah, right, sure. so it's a very limited approach, and it's one of the reasons why, with those approaches back then, but also their derivatives today, which is the majority of the field, basically, you get some successes early on, but then they don't sustain. They fall away.
Because they're, just so I'm understanding, so when there is so that they have the sensors and you have, the trainer reading and setting for the spaceship to
Yes.
whatever, go up higher when a certain brainwave frequency is
Yes.
being used.
hmm
But that when that's not the case, there's no other learning taking place. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct. That's exactly right. So what you want to do is develop again, redevelop, reacquire the intrinsic capability that is already there. The classic antinomy between the classroom performance of the bored, overly active, to use that phrase, ADDer, and their performance when they're playing their favorite video game, for instance. It's not an attentional difficulty. It's a focus of attention. What do I choose to attend to at what time, for what reason? And if it's just a practiced skill, it's going to fall away, because they don't have to practice in the same way to be good at the video game or whatever their thing is. That's not to imply that all of those kids are wonderful, adaptive at video games. No, but they have whatever they really enjoy. And when they enjoy the thing, their attention is right there. The ability is there. The question is, when is it chosen? When is it used? And when is it not? And what else is going on around? So the problem, in my opinion, and my experience with the other approaches overall, is that they focus on what they believe is a skill that can be consciously trained and consciously accessed. And that may be true at times, but for many things, that's just not true. And so it's a very limiting strategy, which has built within it the seeds of its own extinction, of it falling away. What NeurOptimal is really about is reaccessing those intrinsic capabilities of the central nervous system, its resilience and flexibility, that allow it to adapt creatively moment to moment when they're all available, as opposed to being disrupted and interfered with because of certain other patterns that have been learned, trauma patterns or whatever it happens to be for that individual.
So just to kind of summarize, to then go into your 5-phase model as the first
Sure.
design. So you're
Yeah.
seeing there are, the early protocol linear systems where they
Yes.
have recognized certain brainwave bandwidth
Yes.
are associated with certain symptoms. And then and I want you just to say a little bit about this phrase, entrainment and migration.
Right.
Because that's used to describe how the protocol systems work. And maybe you could just say a little bit about that and then talk about kind of the 5-phase model and how that's different in the beginning. We'll go on.
Yeah. In train and migrate, it has a number of connotations. This is actually one of the 4 nonlinear dynamical control procedures. It's a way mathematically of talking about how you can, in engineering terms, control. Most of us would think of it as influence, not control. Like I'm going to be in control, So how can you influence things? And in train and migrate, if well, there's a wonderful scene towards the end of the movie A Bridge Too Far, which is a war movie about the Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands during World War II. And at the very end, the British Airborne Division that's left, the wounded and those staying behind with them, are just there waiting for the Germans to come in and start to cart them off. And at one point, one gentleman starts humming um, a British, well-known British hymn, and soon the entire division that's there is singing this. That's in Train and Migrate. You start a stimulus pattern, and it gets picked up, and it gets echoed, and it gets expanded and reverberated. So the premise is if beta, however we define that, let's just say beta is a good rhythm for focus. If I just send in a stimulus pattern that has the rhythm of beta, and I just keep doing this, the brain is going to start to entrain to that and kind of sing along to it. So, what do you do? Well, those of you who like to listen to certain music to relax, you're probably experiencing some form of train and migrate.
And so, okay, so let's now go into the, because I think it's really helpful for people to understand that the design of NeurOptimal was really only possible as the computing capabilities changed. And I know
Oh,
you
yes.
and I had a conversation after our last interview where we talked about, how many calculations per second, is NeurOptimal making? What kind of computer
Right,
power do you need? And so that's why, in part, I want to just kind of go through the history of NeurOptimal
sure.
and talk about how the capabilities changed so your design could change.
Right, right. It's a kind of analysis known as time frequency analysis, time dash frequency analysis. It's a very specific kind of time frequency analysis. It's the kind of stuff that has been used to find mineral reserves based on satellite imagery or earthquake perfusion patterns. Like where was the original epicenter? How did it spread? How do we know how devastating this has been? How come the ground composition in Mexico City has such a profound impact on the amount of damage that occurs with an earthquake, et cetera? What are those differences? Because you're looking at volume conductions throughout a field of inquiry. Now, a lot of the newer systems use a version of those mathematics to deduce where they believe the problem is down in the brain. So Loretto, QEEG is the sort of generic term for all that, quantified EEG. The problem with that is doing that is either just a snapshot, because you get out a picture of a moment of time, which isn't necessarily helpful about what's happening now. It was a moment then, but that doesn't mean that's what's happening now. Or you're doing these calculations based on averages.
Okay, so going back to the design of your
Mhm.
system, right, which is now you're sort
Yes.
of you're recognizing, or you've always recognized, wow, if we could create a system that could allow the brain to utilize its own capability to become flexible, resilient, responsive to
Yes.
the here and now, that would also kind of alleviate symptoms. And
Yes,
so
exactly.
so tell me about the kind of any more details about the design, and then just in terms of the setup of the system. And you
Mhm.
don't have to go into a lot of detail about the the mathematics part, because
Right.
I don't even think
I
I'll be able to
understand.
ask you follow-up questions.
Right,
Um,
right.
but just helping us understand the sort of basic principles, and also like what you were noticing as you were testing the system over the years and decades. What were you
Sure.
seeing change in the people using the system?
Hmm. Well, yeah, just to give you an example, when I first started talking in the 90s to the field about this idea of math that was time dash frequency based, the comments were, I've never heard this term from everyone else in the field. And I thought, now that's fascinating because maybe you haven't heard the term, but what everybody is actually doing is looking at how the frequency changes intensity at specific times. That, in essence, is what time dash frequency mathematics is all about. So, without knowing it, that's really what you're doing. You're just doing it with the wrong clubs, the wrong kinds of instruments, the wrong tools. It's like, you say, well, the stars go away during the day. No, they don't. If you use a radio telescope, you can see them just as well, whether it's day or night. But if you use an optical telescope, yeah, you can't see them because the sun's there blotting everything out, right? So it's a question of tools, and the mathematical tools were critically important because most of the other system developers really were um, mental health practitioners, or those who were oriented into those kinds of professions, and just had ideas about what they wanted to do. Oh, we want to we want to increase beta and decrease theta. And so the engineer said, oh, okay, so let me make you really simple filters that do that. Well, the original designers didn't know enough of the digital signal processing to say, well, wait a minute, that's not a good way to go for very technical reasons. It's not optimal. It's not as useful or flexible. So the mathematics that I knew allowed me to continually push at the edge of the technology.
And so when you were designing the 5-phase model, and then the
Mhm.
next generation, what
Yes,
kinds of people were you seeing? What was shifting in them? What was the feedback that was helping you
sure.
to tweak the design as well as the
Well, yeah,
technology?
if we go back to the sort of beta theta thing for ADD, and the counter position of the alpha theta, which became the work for consciousness expansion and ultimately substance abuse, other addictive processes, and trauma resolution. That's really what Gene Peniston was most interested in from the beginning. His brother had been a Vietnam vet who was severely impacted, and many people that he knew were. And he wanted to come up with a tool to help them. Well, these two protocols were seen as being antithetical. If you did alpha theta with the classic ADD, or you'd make them worse, make them more that way. If you did the beta theta stuff with the trauma survivor, you'd make them more hypervigilant. You'd make them worse, right? Well, the problem with that is you very rarely find people who are just one or the other. Most everybody comes in with some kind of blend across the range. So what do you do? Well, what a lot of the early approaches did was you'd run some of the beta theta stuff or another variant of that, the SMR theta stuff, and you'd be, tweaking them up a little, then tweaking them down, then tweaking them up, then tweaking them down, based on how agitated they were getting or how much they were ready to fall asleep. And I used to say that was kind of like driving your car down a back alley in New York at 80 miles an hour. You can do it, but you don't have much car left by the time you're done, because you're bouncing off the two walls, right? And there's got to be a safer, a more comfortable way of doing it. And that came about through being able to nuance more and having a richer possibility of feedback options at the time. Instead of trying to train to discrete states, focus versus relaxation, for instance, it was really training to allow resilient and flexible transitioning. So early on, one of the things I did was I was using baseline recordings, meaning no feedback, just 30 seconds of, the sensors on, however many sensors you used, whatever. And the client just watching the screen as kind of a focus point, as a distraction. And for the first 15 seconds, I had them have their eyes open. Then I'd say, now gently close your eyes and keep them closed. And they would close their eyes, and then 15 more seconds, one continuous recording, 30 seconds. So I could see the transitioning that was occurring. And from what I had said earlier, what you would expect from a conventional point of view is you would see that alpha rise once the eyes were closed. That would indicate that they were transitioning into more relaxation. With folks who are trauma survivors, you frequently didn't see that, because when they went inside, they'd start to feel uncomfortable because they didn't know if they were safe. And so they would become more agitated, etc. That's just one small variation. What was fascinating to me about that, for years, I would talk about how I was doing the transitioning between eyes open and eyes closed, and how important that was, because we do it every day at least once to get to sleep. So kind of important to understand, and understanding that was really the basis of Barry Sternman's original work. And the response I got back from the field was, well, no, we understand the difference between eyes open and eyes closed. It's like, I'm not talking about the difference between two states. I'm talking about the transitioning between them. And there was no sense that that was at all important, which to me was fascinating, because that's all I needed, was seeing how well they transitioned, how resilient and flexible were they. Could they make that transition, that's flexibility in a nutshell, and still stay stable? That's resilience. So from the very beginning, the orientation I was trying to move towards was not state dependent. That's another way of talking about the limitation of operant conditioning models, is they're kind of state dependent. You're in the environment in which you receive the reinforcement. You're going to demonstrate the learned pattern of behavior. Without that environment, though, that behavior will extinguish. The capability is there. Your ADD kid, the classic one that I'm talking about now, doesn't have a problem with attention. It's a focus of attention problem. When they're interested, they can be very attentive. When they're disinterested, no.
How long did it take, and what was involved in going from the first sort of version of your system to in NeurOptimal 3.0? And maybe, talking a little bit, as I mentioned to you before we got on, people hate the paste, right? They would love
Right.
to get rid of the paste.
Right.
So,
Right.
talking also about why is the system the way it is today, And
Sure.
maybe I'll stop there and I'll just interject questions as you go, but
Sure. Sure. Well, the first thing is the 5-phase model was a way of being completely diagnostically agnostic. Now, it's a technical way of saying not caring about what somebody came in with. So I didn't try to figure out, oh, so you're depressed mostly. Let's do an anti-depression thing. Let's do something to deal with your depression. I had given up that approach and instead come up with a way to integrate all of the disparate ways that others had developed to work with very specific things, organized it into one comprehensive approach that you could start with step number one with anybody, no matter who they were, and progress them through this, yes, linear sequence based on very clear criteria stated towards the end of the article in an appendix. So anybody using any equipment that was out there at the time could do it. And of course, it was amazing to me to see the resistance to this idea. Not because it didn't work, but because it kind of undermined this belief that there were these discrete protocols and that that's what really mattered.
and so
Right.
when you were using this 5-phase model and, in later generations, what
Right.
were you seeing in the clients that made you go, oh, okay, I'm on to something here. This is working.
That's the other thing. It's empirical in that sense. The whole time has been. What I was finding was I could take anybody through the process and their life would transform in very predictable ways, very enjoyable ways. That depended on the person. So if they came in and they were primarily dealing with, immune involved disorders, the subtext for the 5-phase article was Lyme disease, which back at that time was a real challenge, particularly in Eastern US where I was. Just the whole immune system implications and, no real direct treatment of the underlying problem. Hard to know exactly what was causing it, how to deal with that. Took a long time for for that science around it to develop. So how do you deal with the profound impact on people's lives of this? And that was really what it was about, was even with someone who was immune system compromised with pretty profound Lyme disease manifestation, could use the same approach that an ADD kid could and benefit. And it was clear, these criteria were very clear in terms of the training criteria within the systems. Now, that was because the systems at the time were limited, and that was the only way I could do it, again. So I had these very limited linear systems, which gave me specific numbers out. Well, that was the 5-phase model.
And
As the
when did it
computers got better, they could do that math for me. And so it was gradually a question of developing the capability in the programs to accommodate that. And that was really what prompted Sue and I to finally start to develop on our own. As the system ultimately got more and more capable, as NeuroCare Pro, as it was called originally, was released. And then it was able to be expanded and developed as computing resource again, more and more came online. Um, and we started to make the shift to different models of thresholding and targeting that allowed us to really let go of the last vestiges of any kind of state-based stuff. Um, and at one point, Sue said, "Well, I just had to trust and let go of all the things that I knew in my head to manipulate the setting, the system, the session, in order to move the transformation along." And it was a further extension of Sue and her role in this, which when I was talking about fully automating the system, everybody said, well, but how are you going to get Sue in the box? Because Sue was the clear, wizard or
So
whatever you want to say.
she was, just so for people who don't know, so Dr.
Mhm.
Sue Brown, who is your co-creator of the system, and she
Yes,
was doing a lot of the clinical work, seeing
yes,
how clients were, her patients were responding to the various iterations of the system and giving you the feedback
yes,
so that you could work on the mathematical design end. Is that fair to
yes,
say?
that's exactly right. So the more I was doing the programming, and in the early days, it was me doing all the programming and all the testing and all the tech support and. Now we have like 50, it's almost 50 or so, dedicated people on the Zenguard team. It's really quite stunning to me to be that's the case. Um, but yeah, I had to let my direct clinical time kind of fall away so I could put the time to the programming because it also is something that I had to make sure nobody could steal. It's one of the other things that happened quite a lot during the earlier days was, people would ridicule what I was doing, what we were doing, so and on. And then when they realized that no, they couldn't really ridicule my knowledge base and they couldn't ridicule what the program was doing, then it got switched to, well, we've been doing that all along, which of course I knew none of them could have been. There was a certain piece of mathematics software that none of them knew about, let alone used. So it was quite impossible for them to be doing exactly what we were doing. Now, whether that was fundamentally important or not, is a different issue. I think in many ways it was. But the point was that it was very challenging for me, for both of us, but for me being sort of the guy behind the curtain, if you will, who really understood all of this to be dealing with a whole range of people who didn't understand what we were doing and really didn't have the background to understand. I remember at one point at a conference when somebody said, I don't understand what you're doing. And I said, well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that because that really confirms that what we're doing is unique. You can't even understand it. I get that. I can explain it to you, but I don't think you'll get it even then. You know, and that was part of the reason that my work with Carl Pribram was so important because he got it. He got it from the beginning. It was basically an implementation of his holodynamic model of the central nervous system. So we had a lot of fun at presentations for, for a number of years. He was just such a great guy. He really was, and I miss him to this day.
When did it become fully automated as a system? And what was the
Mhm.
sort of computer power speed required for that? And then let's just talk through just very sort of straightforwardly why is the setup the way it is?
Sure,
And
sure.
just so people can have just a basic understanding of what is NeurOptimal 3.0 doing when someone's hooked
Yeah.
up.
The last piece that made it fully autonomous, I referred to as AutoNav because it was a piece that allowed the trainer to just completely be hands off. And U.S. military talks about fire and forget. You launch the javelin and you can forget about it because it knows what to do to find its target and just get there, right? Similarly, from the beginning, I'd wanted to make what became NeurOptimal be fire and forget, but it required a lot of computing to do that. We finally released version 2.0, which was the first integrated AutoNav that was fully online, and you had to deselect it. That was back in 2010. Now, it could have been released sooner, but I knew that we were going to get pushback from a lot of our trainers because their primary orientation was as clinicians in some form, psychologists, mental health therapists, whatever. And that was going to be a bit of a challenge for them to understand that, in fact, things worked better when they left it alone instead of trying to monkey with it, which is what they had done for years as part of the community of exploring things. Uh, so that was a bit of a challenge because it was fundamentally upsetting that paradigm of, well, yeah, I can kind of let it do its own thing, but when I'm working with a certain kind of client, I really need to get in there and keep it safe or, whatever.
So they
Um,
were having to really kind of understand conceptually too that the design of the system is in mirroring the design of how the brain optimizes itself and in that process relieves symptoms. Would you say that?
exactly. That's exactly right. So optimal is an interesting choice of words because it implies there's some external sort of framework. But the central nervous system is organized around two things: detecting difference and decreasing its discomfort. So when it detects a different way of doing things that decreases its discomfort, it adopts them, particularly if that keeps on working. So, you know, what happens among many other things that happen in addictive process? You have something that seems to work pretty quickly, that seems to work pretty reliably. The problem is there's that habituation, and then there's the addictive result of the change in the body chemistry. And so more and more of the substance gets less and less of the effect. So you just do it increasingly more and more instead of coming up with something different. Um, I used to talk to the addictive process folks and say, look, if I could give you something that worked faster and wasn't illegal and cost you nothing really to do once your brain is just doing it, would you do that instead? Well, yeah, of course. I don't have to, really? Like, I don't have to go out and steal things and get in trouble with the law. And no, you don't. And that's what would happen, except it would be a total transformation. This is some of the stuff that Gene Peniston originally reported with his work, even with the early alpha theta, is that people didn't just stop drinking, let's say alcohol was the addiction. Um, they changed their overall orientation to life. They started doing yoga or some form of exercise, or, you know, they started to develop a spiritual orientation, whatever it was, consistent with their traditional upbringing or something different, or, and so it's a whole person transformation. It's not just, oh, I'm just going to drop this one thing. That's not the way it works, because the central nervous system takes that fundamental strategy, whatever it is, it conserves energy and increases the overall efficiency. Of course, it's going to do that. What do we learn to do first? Do we learn to walk first or to crawl? Well, how come we don't crawl around? Because walking is more efficient. We don't have to be continually reminded. Now remember to walk. That's really important. Don't crawl, right? So I'm always intrigued when people ask the question, like, well, how does the transformation occur? It's the way everything occurs. It's the way you learn to walk. It's the way you learn to talk. It's the way, all these things that you learn growing up that people can't directly teach you. They support you, they help you. It's your own central nervous system, and it's developing neuromuscular, insertions that allow it to develop. So the system is from the beginning individualizing itself moment to moment to the individual brain that is hooked up at that moment.